So Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about the Longsword. Um, I've just started in HEMA, or Historical European Martial Arts, known to those who don't really know much about it as sword fighting. And I guess I just wanted to throw out there one of the reasons why I like the Longsword um, is that if you know anything about the history of weapons, the Longsword is basically the culmination of the cut and thrust sword in its I don't want to say original sense, but in its most often conceived of sense. So when most people think of a cut and thrust sword, they think of a straight bladed, double edged, more or less cross hilted European sword. Whether it's a so called Viking Age sword or whether it's something from the 12th or 13th centuries, or whether it's a long sword or a one handed sword or whatever, this is generally what they think of. But it's worth noting that, of course, as far as swords went, shortly after the heyday of the longsword, and it's worth noting these weren't really around all that long, pun intended. They were around for about 100 years. As a fairly specialized development of the weapon. After that, things kind of split. And you had a tendency for cut and thrust swords in one direction and predominantly thrusting swords in the other. And the predominantly thrusting swords tended to be things like the side sword going into the rapier, going into the small sword, and then some later more or less straight-bladed sabers and so forth. The cut and thrust swords, generally speaking, from this point on, were single-edged. Not always. You had things like the Scottish basket hilt, the broadsword. But almost all the other ones I could think of that were still cut and thrust predominantly. The rapiers could cut, most of them, but they were obviously very designed for sticking the point into the other guy as opposed to, lopping his arm off. A lot of the thrusting swords ended up double-edged just because, it helped to have that tapered design, I think. But if you look at the cut and thrust swords, many of them, with the exception of things like the Scottish basket hilt, tended to be single-edged and often curved, although not always. For example, the falchion, the messer, the various types of hanger, and then virtually every saber that was ever made. Also, things like the backsword, although those usually weren't curved, they were straight, but again, single-edged, cut and thrust weapon. So this was basically it for the double-edged cut and thrust blade. And it's worth noting that many of the single-edged swords that came after this, they had what was called a false edge along the back, which was sometimes partially sharpened down near the point. Backswords, falchions, and messers a lot of times had this. Some sabers. But basically, as far as European swords are concerned, after the longsword, it looks like that was it for this type of cut and thrust sword. And so to me, it's interesting because it was not only a fairly specialized weapon used for such a short period of time, but it was essentially the last iteration of that weapon. After this, there really weren't any more knightly swords, as it were. And, it is what it is. Evolution, archaeology, the changing of techniques. But I think it's kind of cool that this was basically the last of its kind. And maybe that's why, maybe the fact that it occurred so late in the period, so late in the Middle Ages, into the, almost into the Renaissance, is one of the reasons why we have so many sword manuals for it. Which is one of the reasons that, if you're starting out in HEMA, the longsword is probably one of the most easy weapons to start with because there's a lot more material on it. It's a little more accessible in that sense. And it's also a little more accessible in the sense being a two-handed weapon. It's a little easier to manipulate in terms of, you don't need to be able to swing it with one hand for a long time. You can use these one-handed, but obviously they were designed for a two-handed use. So just some of my thoughts on the longsword, and there's a lot of other stuff I'd like to learn about someday, but I just want to get the hang of this first. So right now that's what I'm focusing on. And the truth is, there's a lot that's really cool about it, in my opinion. So there we go. Some people think the longsword is overrated. I'm going to be honest; it does tend to kind of crowd the focus from other weapons in HEMA, from what I've read. But I think it's pretty damn cool, and that's that.